Welcome to episode 17 of The Lowdown Show. I'm Neil Graham. If you think that Dos Equis beer spokesman is the most interesting man in the world, you're wrong, and I can prove it. The honor goes to ADVrider.com founder Chris MacAskill. From a hardscrabble childhood to Stanford, to a career as a geophysicist, to working with Steve Jobs, to his own little family-run business that he sold for a cool $100 million. Chris is one of us, and yet he's not one of us. It's a long chat, but Chris makes it worth your time. But before we dive in, a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Shall we take the plunge? Chris, I've heard so much about your legend over the years as being the founder of ADVrider, and then I've heard all sorts of other stories that may or may not be true. So I'm hoping this morning we can clarify. So you started ADVrider. Give me the origin story.
Yeah, well, so I've always loved motorcycles. I don't know why. My son is good friends with Jeff Bezos, who I've met a few times. And he told us, you don't choose your passions choose you. And I've just always loved two-wheel vehicles, you know. And so I've had various motorcycles, mini bikes as a kid and all that. And I had a high-pressure job and teenagers at home and so on for a number of years. I was CEO of a company that went public and had to compete with Amazon. It was a very difficult job. And I had a son who went down to Brazil and got sick with dengue fever and came close to death. He was in a hospital with an oxygen tent and so on. And it all just kind of accumulated. And I told my wife and kids, I just want to get on a motorcycle and ride. So without much planning, I got on a red BMW street bike, K1200 RS, and I decided to go to Mexico. I didn't have any plans, just go to Mexico. And and when I did, I found out that was the wrong motorcycle to take to Mexico. And the potholes were deep, and I'd hit the bash plate and so on. The topes, you know, the speed bumps in the little villages, yes. I couldn't go over them without high centering. So I had to go at an angle. My air filter filled up with butterflies. It was butterfly season, and I didn't understand why my bike died on the side of the road. And I had to figure that out. There were no parts for a K1200 RS out there, and I was in the middle of nowhere. But, you know, I rode it down through Mexico City and all the way to Acapulco, which was an unbelievable drive from Mexico City to Acapulco.
And what year is this, Chris?
That's a good question. It would have been the year that ADV was founded, however long ago that was, 25 years maybe. And so I don't know the exact year. Somewhere on ADV, I've written it up. But anyway, and, you know, it was just so poorly planned. I'd get in these these two-way streets that are very narrow. And some of the truckers would take those streets because they didn't have to pay the toll for the tollways. And Mexico was building these big, beautiful freeways with tollways and everything, but nobody was on them. So I was having to jet past these trucks and learn what they meant with a left blinker on to give you, you know, to let you go by and so on. And so the power of the K1200 RS was so great. But on the other hand, it was a 685-pound bike. And whenever I've eventually figured out the tollways were for me. And whenever I'd stop, there'd be pools of oil at the tolls. And trying to keep a 685-pound bike up while your boots are on the oil was insane.
Right.
And I also figured out that there's some rich Mexicans with BMWs and Porsches and Mercedes that just go boom. Nobody checks their speed there. And so I started following them, and pretty soon I was doing 90, 100, 110 behind some of these cars. And eventually I settled on I can go 120 here and I can really get around Mexico. And that's what I did, because my wife had a little bit of emergency when I was staying in Mexico City, and she needed me home in 2 days. So I just turned the throttle to 120 and rode to El Paso that way. And then from El Paso that was 1,000-mile day. And then from El Paso to my home in Silicon Valley, that was another 1,000-mile day. And so it was 11 days total. I took a camera and took pictures. It was film in the day. And and I just loved it. It was the needle in my arm. But of course, I was an idiot, and it's amazing I survived. So I started thinking about, how does one prepare for one of these trips? There must be a forum somewhere I can go to and read about it. There were a few forums, but they weren't on the kind of motorcycles that I was interested in. I wanted the Jeep of motorcycles with more clearance, and you could fall, and it had crash bars and all that kind of stuff. And I had seen one on Google's campus, I think, when Google was just starting, or a company near there. And it was a black and yellow BMW Airhead with crash bars. And when I saw that thing, I just thought, oh my gosh, that's what I'm looking for. I want one of those. And but they were coming out with new version with the oil head. I think this was around 1996 or something. And the oil head surged, and I didn't like the surging. And so I was looking around for other kinds of motorcycles. There was a rumor that KTM was going to come out with a V-twin. That sounded amazing, because I needed power to get past those trucks. There was a Triumph Triple, but you couldn't get parts for it, a Triumph Tiger, and it was kind of new on the market, and it had a reputation of breaking down. So I just didn't know what motorcycle I wanted. So on just an impulse, I decided to buy forum software and put it on a home computer and call it ADVrider, because I had an adventure. And my family's big joke was, let's go have an adventure. And an adventure meant all kinds of chaos would ensue, and drama and excitement and everything else. So I just called it ADVrider. And then I looked around for people who would help me get this started, because I didn't really know how to do these forums. And I found Crash and Fish, who were on another forum for BMW RT street bike. And that forum was a little bit dull. I don't remember the name of it, but I just remember it was kind of dull, and I wanted something more exciting. So I got Crash and Fish, and I got excitement and drama and adventure with those guys. They were great. They helped set it all up, and then chaos ensued.
And in terms of the forum in the early years, was it mostly you posting? Was it other people? I mean, how quickly did it develop a following? Was it a long process, or did it happen quite organically?
It happened quite organically, pretty fast. I established several different accounts. Part of that was just testing to see, how it worked and how you respond and all that kind of stuff, just Q&A. But then I found out if I had 3 different personalities, that I could make like there was a little bit of traffic. And Crash and Fish had been banned everywhere. They'd gone. So they were eager to post. And Fish was especially instrumental in telling me, well, you need a forum for this, you need a forum for that, and so on. And he was a real BMW diehard, and he didn't want me having other brands on the site, as I remember. I wanted to have a Triumph subsection and a KTM subsection, and that was the first sort of a little struggle that we had. And he wanted an off-topic forum, and he's the one who came up with the name Joe Mama, and which had some attitude. He and Crash had a lot of attitude. But Fish, he thought of the basic forum outline that we have. I added a few things. I wanted trip reports, because I wanted to live vicariously. I had another job, and I wanted to live vicariously through everybody who's going on. So we started ride reports. I wanted some other brands of bikes, so I eventually put my jaw out and added some of those. It'd be interesting if Fish were here sitting beside me saying, "Oh, it didn't happen that way. I had the idea for that," or something.
He would contradict everything you said, probably. Right?
I would contradict some things, I'm sure. And that was our the lovely aspect of our relationship. But anyway, you know, things like the mechanic forums and so on like that, we would, Fish would moderate some of them, I would moderate some of them, Crash would moderate some of them, and we'd invent new ones as members came on. And I think it was just the first forum for motorcycles of that type. And the term adventure motorcycles hadn't been coined. And the BMW Airheads, you know, it was just a small slice of what they did. Mainly motorcycling back then was more street bike oriented, and Harley was riding high, one of America's great companies. And so we were in this little niche, and I was wishing and hoping for these kind of motorcycles. And look what's happened over however many years it's been, 25 or something like that. Amazing. I mean, BMW had named their motorcycle the Adventure, and so did KTM. And adventure motorcycling became, you know, just part of the lingo. I don't know if that had to do with ADVrider, but everybody that I knew was on ADVrider back in those days. And in those days, I would always stop when I'd see a motorcycle or motorcyclist doing something like riding up the Alaska Highway, which I did later. I was always stop and ask them, you know, how was your ride? How's your motorcycle? Have you heard of ADVrider? You know, and all that stuff. And people just jumped in. They, you know, I didn't have any advertising. I just paid for it myself, whatever. I didn't worry about the brand. I didn't copyright it or anything like that. People came up with the stickers and everything. I didn't do any of that. The rallies, people just jumped in and organized the rallies. I had nothing to do with that. And those rallies, meeting in what we called meet space, was really key to putting a face to a name and having a real experience with somebody. And I think it, you know, it brought us even closer together.
I had a conversation recently with Austin Vince, the Englishman who did Mondo Enduro and made some of the early adventure films. And he talked about just after the Berlin Wall fell, riding through Eastern Europe. And they'd never, you know, it was just how bizarre it was. Everybody driving the same kind of car, absolute, you know, unfamiliarity with the West. And he said something kind of interesting, which is that the very sort of community that you created with ADVrider, or that he made through his films, which were eventually shown on television and ended up with millions and millions of viewers in English television, that they sort of destroyed the naivete of those early travel years, that he couldn't take that kind of trip again, just as you today wouldn't take the trip with your KBMW. There's too much information out there, and that information, not only it sort of helps you travel, but it also takes away a certain sense of adventure. I mean, what's your view of that?
It's become a little more sterile. That's true. Now you can go on Airbnb and find all these wonderful places to stay, which I do all the time. And there's packing lists. I didn't have any of that. In fact, when I had a bag on the back and a top case on the back. It's all I had. And I just put a jacket in there and toothpaste and toothbrush and I don't know what. And when I got to Mexico, I didn't know for border crossings and all that kind of stuff. When I got to Mexico, I had to dig in that case and get something, probably my passport or something. And then when I took off, I forgot to latch the case. So the top was popping around, but I didn't know it. I had earplugs and a helmet on. And some car came beside me and started pointing, you know, at my case, which was flapping. And when I stopped by the side of the road, most of my clothes were gone. I still had a toothbrush. My jacket was gone. Most of my stuff was gone. Fortunately, my passport was in my pocket. And so I just had this case. And then later on, I lost my motorcycle jacket too. So I had to just go into a big variety store and buy a regular jacket so I didn't freeze to death. I didn't know it was cold in Mexico at the high altitudes. yeah, it was real adventure. It was raw and even did I even have a cell phone? I don't think so. I think I had to call from the hotel room. Um, I did have a camera though, but it was film, so I couldn't really transmit images of what I was doing. Because one of the things that I did as soon as I crossed the border, I was feeling kind of bad about going bald. My hair was turning into moss, and so I just took a razor and bicked my head. I shaved every little bit of it off, and and my wife decided I had gone crazy. When I called her and told her this, I had to stand there at a phone booth, putting in all kinds of money, Mexican money, trying to talk her off the ledge because she thought I'd lost it. The pressure had gotten to me, and I'm off in Mexico and I shaved my head, and what it's gotten into you. That's one of the reasons I had to come home. She was so worried about me. And so when I got home, I had to speak at a big convention in New York City. And I mean, it was an audience size of like 2,000 people. And when I got up there to speak, no one recognized me. It was American Booksellers Association or something like that. And because I'd bicked my head. So somebody who did recognize me when I came afterwards and smiled, he said, "Baldy, we're going to call you Baldy from now on." So that stuck. And then when I registered on ADVrider, I just made my nickname Baldy, and now all my kids call me Baldy.
No.
Friends
So
and
the very
family.
thing you were self-conscious about has become your nickname.
Yeah.
Oh,
But it came. Oh, there's so many stories. One is my background is geophysics. I'm an earth scientist, and
we'll get
or at
into
least
that in a minute, but yeah.
but at least I was in the beginning, and I'm back into it now. So I was asked by TEDx Boston, to give a talk on the sort of diet and its effect on the planet. Agriculture and its effect on the planet, and beef turns out to be the runaway huge, monster. It's 10x the impact of any other meat like pork or chicken or fish, and 100x any kind of plant. So I'm giving this talk called "One Simple Change to Save Our Forests," because beef is causing deforestation of the Amazon, for example. So I let my beard grow long on one side and short on the other side, and it was to symbolize that we've deforested almost half the earth now for agriculture. And so this is the forested side and this is the deforested side. But somebody made the crack that I was also an authority on desertification, turning things into a desert, because I could show that off too.
Oh, I
So
see.
I said that in the beginning of my TED talk, and the audience just fell to pieces. And then I asked Siri to do face recognition, and I'd pre-programmed it to say, and I held it by the microphone to say, "What happened to your face?" So that was the start of my TEDx talk. But anyway, Baldy that came because I shaved my head in Mexico.
eBay Motors is here for the ride. This week's Fireside Chat is about getting away from it all. Chris tore off in his BMW to Mexico and points farther south, and came back a different man and started ADVrider.com. My version of that is a little bit more humble, which is a 500-mile ride on a Ducati 916 to Manhattan when my marriage was crumbling. I had a 4-year-old at the time. And I knew that the life that I was going to come back to had nothing to do with the life that I'd lived up to that point. And somehow the motorcycle trip fortified me. And I've never really had it properly explained by anyone or read about it in a way that totally makes me understand why the motorcycle was essential to the trip. But it was because you could take a car or a bus or my Volkswagen bus or walk or swim or do whatever. But it's not really the same. For some reason, you need to travel by motorcycle, and that it's not something you can easily explain is beautiful. And it's why whenever my life gets complex, as it has of late, I just throw a leg over a motorcycle and somehow I return and I'm just a little bit more grounded than I was before. Now, a word from our sponsor. With over 122 million parts, you can make sure your number one ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof racks, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, and of course, exclusions will apply. Now back to my conversation with Chris MacAskill. You're listening to The Lowdown Show, presented by ADVrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. Well, getting back to this notion of your wife thinking you'd lost your mind, do you think there was any validity in that? Maybe it's too personal a question. I don't know. But do you think that there was somehow the motorcycle trip to this notion of I don't know. Take me through that. Did you talked initially about pressures of life and work and family and your son's illness, and I mean, did you come back a different person after those trips?
Yeah, I did. And so I had started an internet bookstore called Fat Brain, and we decided to specialize in technical books, like some of the science books you see behind me. And 3 days after deciding to do that and leaving my well-paid job, Amazon announced, and they had been working on Amazon for a year, and they had a bookstore with 1 million titles in it, and they'd already had 6 million in financing from venture capitalists, and we had nothing but my little bank account. And so that's why we decided to focus on technical books. And I thought technical books had a higher price point. People tended to buy more together. So our average order size would be larger, so we could pay for the pick and pack fees. And Amazon business model didn't look too good. So we decided to run with it. And just like ADVrider took off, FatBrain took off. It went from 0 to 100 million in 4 years. And the growth rate was such that it became a kind of a Silicon Valley darling. And we were able to take it public on the NASDAQ. Well, once you're public on the NASDAQ, you are under all kinds of pressure to keep that growth going. And we were going at 30% a quarter. So
a quarter?
It was like a rocket ship.
Wow.
So, but what was happening was the internet was eating into technical book sales because you didn't necessarily have to have the book anymore. There were all kinds of forums about programming and things like that. And so book sales from brands like O'Reilly were not doing as well. O'Reilly had to lay off some employees, Wiley and all those. And I wanted to expand to do other things, just like Amazon was doing. And it was when Amazon was still weak and it was considered Amazon.toast. And we were strong. And a friend of mine had started eBay, a guy who used to work for me, and they were strong. We went public on the same day, and both had great public offerings. But my board, the venture capitalists who invested in us, and they didn't invest a lot of money. It was $6 million. They just didn't, they wanted it to stay focused, and they didn't think Amazon was going to succeed by going into electronics and all that kind of stuff. They just thought they're nuts. So I just couldn't get, I didn't have majority share. I just couldn't get permission to expand beyond these technical books. They said the market is big enough, what are you worried about? And, at least I wanted to focus on, we could sell computers and things like that, software there. I mean, the world was open for people who bought books like this. A lot of them were buying computer books. There were other computer things they would buy from us. And I had experimented with that, and they would. But anyway, that was sort of limiting our growth. So we were having trouble making it quarter to quarter because 30% growth rate was hard. We did it, for 2 years, but it was like, woof. So there was that pressure. And then one day I got a call from, we were Mormon in the day, and my son was a Mormon missionary. And we got a call from the mission president in Sao Paulo saying, Ben is in the hospital. He's been there for a week or two. And the doctor thinks he has a very severe case of either cancer, type 2 diabetes, or HIV. And he swears he couldn't have HIV, but he's in an oxygen tent and he's down to 120 pounds and he's 6'5", and it's bad. And I said, I'll catch the next plane out. But unfortunately, I had to be in New York 3 days later for a shareholder meeting. Another friend of mine had lost his 19-year-old son, went to his funeral in Ireland. I don't know why he died. He had a market cap of $2 billion for that company. And when a reporter saw him at the funeral of his son, his market cap dropped to $1 billion. And then the shareholder lawsuits started and everything because he hadn't revealed that his son had died. And I didn't know what to do. And the law was very unclear. And I didn't have time to think about it. I was just going to get on a plane to Sao Paulo. And the mission president said, no, it's against church rules. Parents are not allowed in the mission field with their kids. I don't know why, I guess because I was an obedient Mormon. I don't know why, but I said, okay. And I didn't go. So I went to New York to give that talk. I was a bishop in the Mormon church, of all things. And so that puts you in charge of a congregation. So I'm not only running a CEO of a company, I have teenagers at home and I'm a bishop. You could see the pressure. And the boss of a bishop is a stake president. So a bishop oversees a congregation, and a stake president oversees a number of congregations, about 8. And you always tell the stake president when there's a crisis with a family. And I thought this was a crisis with me, but I didn't think to. I was very close to him, but I didn't think to do it. I just, my son is dying. What do you think? And at that time, and so I give my talk like a robot in New York because I'm thinking Ben the whole time. And then I fly to Boston that night, go into the Marriott, had to give more financial talks in the morning to raise more money. And I get a call from the stake president. Now I had a flip phone, a Motorola flip phone, and I was on the elevator and it was full of people and we were going down from the 26th floor. And he said, Chris, this is President Hansen. And I thought, and the phone hung up because I was in an elevator shaft. And I thought, he's a man of few words. I know what he's going to say. The only reason they would call the stake president, he said he had just talked to a doctor at the church headquarters in Provo. He'd gotten that far in the conversation, but he hadn't told me what the doctor said. I assumed he was going to tell me that Ben had passed. And at that moment, I realized I had forgotten to tell my wife that, or to rehearse what I would tell my wife if he passed. I didn't have those words. I didn't know what to say. How could I tell her? She's in California. I'm in Boston, and this is bad. So the elevator kept stopping because it was filled with people, and they were going to parties and everything. And so by the time we got to the lobby of the Marriott, I was in a suit and tie and wingtip shoes. I ran out into the boulevard in front of the Marriott in Copley Square. And there was a cement barrier. The boulevard was 6 lanes, I think. And there's a cement barrier in the middle. And I thought I would get cell coverage there. So I just ran through the traffic, put my hand out to slow the cars down and jumped on that barrier in my wingtips, called President Hansen back and said, what? And he said, they've decided that Ben is well enough that they can send him home. And it's like, oh my God. And I just felt the blood drain out of my body. It's like, oh my God, I thought you were going to say he had passed. And so I had this public company. I didn't know what to tell the public. Were there going to be shareholder lawsuit? I mean, the main thing that was on my mind was Ben. And so all this was coming down. We decided to sell the company to Barnes & Noble because Barnes & Noble disagreed with Amazon's strategy and my investor strategy, and a lot of people, in the financial world, of Amazon being the everything store. They thought, no, you got to specialize, and you guys are really good at the internet, and we're not here at Barnes & Noble, so let's buy you. And so they bought us, and now I'm very I can't remember the timing, but I do remember that we had a board meeting every month with Barnes & Noble. The venture capitalists were off the board. Now Barnes & Noble people were on the board. Steve Riggio, who was president of BN.com and president of Barnes & Noble. And they would come out on their private jet once a month to Silicon Valley for our board meetings. And I would go out to New York on alternate months for their board meeting. And one day, I think this was before my trip to Mexico, but I forget the timing. One day I went to their board meeting. It's down by the World Trade Center, big plate glass windows. And as we're beginning the meeting, Steve Riggio says, "Oh my God, there's smoke coming from the World Trade Center, one of the towers. My aunt works on the 104th floor. What's going on?" And so we all went to the windows and we started looking at it, and the World Trade Center is on fire. Whoever heard of something like that? How did a fire start in the World Trade Center? And so we're sitting there kind of glassy-eyed thinking, we've never seen anything like this before. And the chief financial officer for Barnes & Noble said, "Look, a plane has come to help. I guess it's going to extinguish the fire." And we all went quiet and we watched, and somebody said, that's a commercial plane. And it flew into the World Trade Center, big ball of flame right in front of us. And it's like, what just happened? We're under some kind of attack. There are planes falling from the sky. This is crazy. And I think we were on the 22nd floor or something of their building. And so we ran out into the street. I decided to stay away from where my hotel was in Times Square because I thought that would be a target. I was trying to find a place that wouldn't be a target for more planes falling from the sky. And there were some bars and restaurants and so on who had TVs running with CNN. And they were saying one ran into the Pentagon. And it was like, oh my gosh, what's going on here?
Wow.
So I eventually decided to walk down on Avenue of America to see if see what I could see. And I think her name is Ashley Bandmiller. She was a CNN journalist who was standing on the top of a CNN truck with lights and everything else as emergency vehicles were going by. I mean, hundreds of emergency vehicles. And she was, narrating what was going on. And there we had seen some bodies jump. It was awful. So as I'm standing there in obvious shock, a policeman comes up to me and asks if I would volunteer. And I thought, okay. And he asked another guy too, actually a couple, but that guy was he looked pretty big and strong, and I'm 6'4". And so I thought, I wonder what they want. Do they want us to carry body bags? Because I know there's a lot of bodies, and they brought in 4,000 body bags because Ashley just said so. And he led us through the wreckage. This was before the towers collapsed, I think. And no, it wasn't before the towers collapsed, because one of the towers was down because there was that grid, that I-beam grid that you saw on TV that looked that big, mesh, steel mesh. And, but it was like football field size when you walked by it. And there was that fire engine that got flattened to a foot. You see, I've tried not to think about this for a while. It got smashed to about a foot thick, and I walked past that. I couldn't tell my family because all the cell phones were jammed. And then they took me to the first aid tent, and what they wanted us to do was to irrigate the eyes of the emergency workers, and they were going to teach us how to do that. But they looked at me and talked to me, and they could tell I was in obvious shock. So they led me back out. They kept the other guys. I don't like blood, and I don't like trauma and all that. I faint. So they walked me back out, and I stood there for hours and watched tower number 7, the red one or orange one, was burning. And I wanted to see it collapse if it was going to collapse. We were all staying away from it. And then eventually I was able to get through to my son, Don, and leave him a voicemail. And he recorded that voicemail. I have it somewhere. And, And then we were 8 days locked down in New York City before we could get out. It was hushed, quiet. People, they weren't honking. They were letting you go. That was not the character of New York, that's for sure. And when we did get out, we had to take a train to Philadelphia. And then when we got to Philadelphia, the traffic was hustling and bustling and all that. I couldn't believe it. It was culture shock. Other people wanted me to participate in meetings from California once the phone lines were, and it was like, don't you understand? The world just ended. I mean, I don't ever want to work again. This is crazy. And then I flew to San Francisco and drove my car down the freeway. Could not believe life had gone on. And it didn't just go on for New Yorkers, at least for people that I was around. And I think it was after that. So that was in 2001. I think it was after that I took that motorcycle trip. I just wanted to get away from it all. Ben almost died. The World Trade Centers fell down. I was right there. Get me on a motorcycle and get me out of here. And I think that's why my wife thought I had cracked.
Wow, Chris, that's an amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's an amazing tale. And can I assume from all this that you're a lapsed Mormon?
I am, yeah. Yeah, that's a whole different story. I'm not bitter about it. I still have family in the church. My daughter is a very faithful Mormon, and she has 6 kids, and she has a wonderful husband, and they're both very, very faithful.
Right.
My 3 sons left the church with their wives, and they were all their wives were all very faithful and everything. My wife grew up in the church, and so it was a hard exit. But I maintain great friendships, and I sometimes go back when my daughter's children are here. I take them to church, and my wife sometimes goes with them to church when she's up at their house. So I have good feelings about it, but no, I'm not active anymore.
I thought unbecoming a Mormon was like leaving the Hells Angels. Did I get that wrong?
I've never left the Hells Angels, so I have no point of comparison. But I do remember when I grew up in Oakland. I grew up in the hard streets of Oakland. There were Hells Angels all over the place, and they were nice guys. They were nice to kids. I don't know.
It was always the best neighborhood to be in because all the riffraff kept away.
Yeah.
Paradoxically, the Hells Angels kept the bad guys away.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know that much about them. I've ridden up to the top of. I've done some Easter rides and so on. Went up to the top of Mount Tam and did some photographs up there. And there were various different motorcycle gangs up there with their leather jackets and everything. And I walked around and photographed them all. And they're the nicest guys in the world. So I don't know.
So take me through you've had this amazing sort of, as you've just told us, what precipitated this motorcycle trip. And if any activity, demanded it to get away from it all, it was certainly what you witnessed, what you were part of. Both with your son and witnessing 9/11. But take us through your education. I mean, you talked about, you were this powerful business guy who built these empires and the stresses that come with them, which you gave us a sense of, which those of us who don't have business empires could only, fathom. But take me through your education and what you're doing now, because what you're doing now is, you alluded to it earlier, but just catch us up on what interests you now.
Well, it's the craziest thing because, I mean, some of these stories are too unbelievable to be true. It could only happen to me. People say that, but the people who were with me at the time say, no, actually, it was worse than you described. Like my childhood, my sisters would say, no, we visited you a few times. It was worse. And there are several stories, I will never tell about my childhood, but my mother graduated from Cornell with a master's in organic chemistry. She was runner-up for homecoming queen at USC, beautiful and smart, and had a job in cancer research. And when she was pregnant with me, she got struck by adult schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is devastating. And she started worrying about the communists. We had Senator McCarthy in the day who was doing all this terrible language. And so she had to be confined to what was then called an insane asylum. And so I lived with my grandparents from age up to age 7. And then for some reason, social programs come and they go, and there was a cutback, and I don't know all the answers, but she got out of her insane asylum and drove a beat up old Ford to California. California has more liberal mental illness laws and a mild climate and so on. So people who are mentally ill or on the street or something, it's an attractive place to be. So she came out to California and she sent a telegram to my grandparents saying, "Send Christopher." Don't ask me why my grandparents did it. They knew my mom's condition, but they loaded me on it. They bought me a suit and loaded me on a TWA jet connecting in Chicago. I was 7 years old, and I ended up in the San Francisco airport, and my mom forgot to pick me up. And I sobbed and cried. And I remember, Miriam MacAskill, please pick up a white courtesy telephone. But eventually they located her, and I went to live with her in a beat up old apartment in East Oakland. And she let me go to second grade a little bit, but she was too afraid the communists were going to steal me because of what Senator McCarthy had said. They're tapping our phone lines. So we couldn't have phones, couldn't do any of that kind of stuff. And schizophrenics get this addictive, they start smoking and drinking. And so she did that. And the $250 in alimony we got every month went to smoking and drinking and my Superman comics and that I could buy at the liquor store. And we became homeless street people. And I knew my mom was mentally ill, but one thing she said that I thought could be true is that if you ever get caught playing hooky, meaning not going to school, you will have to go to San Quentin for life. So I wasn't going to be seen during the day. I'd hide in drainage culverts where no one would go and find me.
And you weren't going you weren't going to school at this point.
No school. So I ended up in juvenile hall for shoplifting, and part of what we ate was what I shoplifted. And so in sixth grade, they located my father. I thought he lived in Spain, but he lived across the hill in Orinda. And he had a new fourth wife and a new home, and he took custody of me, and I was supposed to start sixth grade. And obviously that was a big fail because I wouldn't tell anybody that I hadn't gone to school because I didn't want to go to San Quentin. So I couldn't figure out what those kids were saying when they were doing times tables and diagramming sentences and prepositional phrases and all that. So they could see immediately there was something wrong with me, and they put me in all the remedial learning classes. And these angels that I never told, what had happened, they just had the patience of saints, and they taught me arithmetic and all that. And somehow I managed to graduate from eighth grade, just barely, with a C- average, and get into high school. I somehow started sixth grade a year. I was a year older than the other kids. I don't know how that happened. And I met a science teacher in ninth grade who had his face burned off from a bad science experiment. The other kids made fun of him like they did me. My nickname was the retard. And he took me under his wing and taught me a lot about science, and I fell in love with it. And he showed me that I could actually do it. And so I did okay in high school. I just couldn't pass English. I got D's in English. So I got into UC Santa Barbara. Since I couldn't pass English, I got let go after a year. And then I met a girl. And she had just graduated. She's upstairs. I was 19. She was 21. And she was Mormon. I'd never heard of Mormons other than there was some temple and it was like a Eastern religion. And I had trouble confessing to her what had happened to me at UC Santa Barbara and how I couldn't come back because I failed. And I couldn't tell her about my background, but she wanted me to give it a try and go back to college. And she would tutor me in English and get me through English. Well, you do anything for a girl, and you can't have your best girl be smarter than you and you be a flop out while she's a Phi Kappa Phi graduate. Come on. So, and my mom had said she had one dream for me, and that is go to a great university and get your master's degree like I did at Cornell. It changed my life. And I adored my mom, and she was in an institution at that point, and I wanted to fulfill her dream. And so for 4 years at the University of Utah, who would accept me, I dreamed of that. And somebody gave a talk on education that changed my life. my story is too long. And I began to get A's, straight A's at University of Utah. I couldn't believe it. The retard was getting straight A's. And I was getting A's in calculus and everything else. With the new learning method he taught me and my wife's tutoring. And so I applied to Stanford, and I got a full scholarship to get a master's degree from Stanford in geophysics. And I've had the strongest relationship with them ever since. I was there with them last night for 6 hours. I kiss the ground every time I walk on the campus because I just can't believe I was there. The dean of admissions told us they have so many straight A students, they can only accept 1 out of 10 straight A students, but they will accept A and F students because A and F students know what they want in life, and they'll ignore everything else and become really good at whatever it is. Well, I was an A and F student.
A and F is?
Yeah. They will accept A and F students.
And what does A and F stand for? I'm sorry.
F is a failing grade on your transcript.
Oh, I see A and F. Oh, sorry. I thought it was like an acronym or something. I got you. See.
No,
Gotcha.
Sorry. And that's what I was. And so I chose geophysics. It's where I got scholarships and everything. And I loved the earth. And it just was a great degree for me. It involved math and physics and all those things that Mr. Davis had me fall in love with in 9th grade. And so I went to become a geophysicist for 10 years. And it turns out you have to travel around the world to very risky places. And you're away from your family a lot. And after I was stuck in Bogota, Colombia for 11 days behind bulletproof glass, long story, I came home and my 4 kids wanted to have a family caucus. My oldest son, who's a geek, said, "Dad, we can't understand geophysics in your way a lot, and Mom worries about you, and so do we. Can't you go, work on computers? We can understand that. We love computers. And there's a revolution going on in computers. You could work for Steve Jobs." I was like, no, I make a good living here in Houston, and it's all about geophysics, and Steve Jobs doesn't hire geophysicists. And I could see their heads just look at their feet. And it's like, what? Oh my gosh, I've disappointed my kids, and I'm going to continue with this career that's probably going to get me killed. 6 of us who graduated from Stanford, I'm not making this up, 6 of us in that same program, well, 1 was in a slightly different program, died in the first 10 years out in the field as a geophysicist. 1 in a volcano blast, and 1 in a truck wreck, and 1 in a helicopter crash. Jeez. And it's like, okay, I'm one of the 3 of the 10 who survived that. And my kids want me to change my career. So I left my high-paid job as a vice president of research and development for this big company. And we moved to Silicon Valley. We had somebody rent a home for us. I moved here without a job in a U-Haul truck. And I spent 6 months listening to Comdex tapes. You could buy these cassette tapes for $450 of this computer conference. And I listened to them to become, to learn the language. And then when I got to California, I had to start interviewing. Stanford hired me as a visiting scientist for a year. And then I got a call from Steve Jobs' new company to come work there. And so I did. I ended up working for Steve Jobs. It was one of the greatest adventures of my life. I couldn't believe it. And the thing that made it work is for the Macintosh, the people who ran the Macintosh are all my good friends, developed the Macintosh. Steve just had a penchant for hiring people with different backgrounds. Instead of hiring all computer scientists and hardware engineers and all that, Joanna Hoffman, who was my boss later on, had a PhD in Middle East archaeology from the Oriental Institute. She was a short Jewish woman. She couldn't go do it. She thought she would go to Iran and do archaeology, but then the Shah was overthrown and she could no longer go to the Middle East to do archaeology. What's she going to do? So she starts casting around. Somebody at Apple figures out how brilliant she is and asks her to be the product manager for the Macintosh. Bill Atkinson, who's one of the great geniuses of Silicon Valley, he was getting his PhD in neurology at University of Washington, and Steve spent a whole day talking him into coming to Apple. He developed 70% of the Macintosh code, Quick Draw, Mac Paint, Mac Draw, HyperCard, he's just amazing. And we hired Susan Kerr, who was an artist, to come design like the icons for the Macintosh. It's like, what is
Wow.
Steve doing? It's just so crazy. And he was willing to hire me. And so this jolly band, and we developed, things like the iPhone. So it was just crazy. It was just crazy. It was such a ragged band. They had a pirate flag on the building, it's a bunch of renegades. And you know how he thought everybody should think different, and people
Right.
who think they can change the world are the ones who do. And we just had this idiotic band of people who thought they could change the world. And not only that, he bought this hardware company that did animations called Pixar from George Lucas, kind of on a lark, and for $5 million. And because it was a hardware company, he thought he knew something about computer company, he thought he knew something about that, and he liked computer animation. Oh man, that was a struggle to get that company off the ground. He cut so many $10 million checks to Pixar. One of them he gave me, and he said, run this up to Ed Catmull, who's CEO of Pixar. They have 72 employees, and I told them they got to go down to 36. I can't afford this anymore. I've put $50 million into this company. Here's another 10 million, but we got to do something different. I mean, we did some shorts, 7-minute shorts that play in the theaters, and we don't get any money for that. The hardware business isn't working out. I told him he had to lay off half the staff, but keep John Lasseter, who's the storyteller, and his merry band of 5 people. And because I have something in mind for them. So I went up to San Leandro. I know these stories sound unbelievable, but there were people with me. I've told them publicly in public documentaries. There's a public documentary called General Magic where I tell some of these stories. That was one of the hit documentaries of a few years ago. And but so I go arrive at the Pixar parking lot with this $10 million check, and Ed is in the parking lot. The great Ed Catmull is in the parking lot helping employees load their boxes into their car because they just found out that morning that they had to be laid off because Steve got an impulse that morning to lay them off. And I gave Ed that check, and I'll never remember it. I'll never forget his hangdog expression of, is this the last check that Steve's gonna give us? I don't know, Ed. I just don't know. Is Steve trying to get a movie contract through Disney? And I was like, you know something about that? Because I don't know much about that. But do you know that Jeff Katzenberg, the head of Disney Studios, had visited us a couple of times? And my office was just upstairs from the conference room, and I'd seen Steve go down to visit with Jeff Katzenberg a few times. So I told Ed that, but I didn't know anything more. And he said, you have to tell Steve. You go back and you tell Steve, we cannot do a movie. We can't. We absolutely can't do it. It's too long. We've only ever done something 7 minutes long. Tell him if he wants something to do with Disney, we can do a TV episode, 24 minutes. That's all we can do. Especially now that he's laid off half my staff. You got to tell him this is an emergency. We can't do it. If he gets a contract, we can't fulfill it. But of course, Steve is Steve, and he signed the contract. It's a terrible contract. No animated film had ever exceeded like $70 million in sales. And looking at that contract, it's like we go broke, even if it, gets a Disney movie box office of 70 million. What are you thinking here? I mean, this is crazy. And it's got to be. So they had a placeholder. John Lasseter made a placeholder name for the movie called Toy Story. It was just a placeholder. And the saga developed over the next 4 years. I wasn't there for a lot of it, most of it. The fallout with Disney, and Katzenberg decided to go to DreamWorks and do Ants, and tell them, I'll show them how to do an animated movie. They don't know how to do it. Katzenberg wanted Woody to be an evil character and didn't want Tom Hanks to be, think Cruella de Vil and all the other Disney movies. They have an evil character in there. And Lasseter didn't want that. And Lasseter had been fired by Disney, so he had a history with them. And it was a mess. But when that movie came out, it just took off. Steve was patient enough to let it go for 4 years. It took off. Pixar was able to go public, and that put Steve back on the map. And that's how Next got bought by Apple, and the operating system we had made, Next Step, that took us 5 years of blood, sweat, and tears, and by us, I'm using the royal us, it was much less me than those guys, that became OS 10 and drove the renaissance that became Apple. And OS 10 became is what drove the iPhone too. So amazing, just amazing. And I was there for all that because my sons told me, stop geophysics. So my feeling of my life is I kind of been forced out of things that I wanted to do and loved to do, but then couldn't do. So I had to make the best of something else, and the best of something else ended up being better than the thing that I had before. It's crazy.
There's a lot of serendipity in both your personal life and your professional life, it seems. As you say, you had to make do with something else. But I mean, that must change one's perspective on life, does it not?
Well,
do you view it as a certain? How do you think of that as almost like a spiritual intervention or religious intervention? Or
well, yeah, there are certain central elements that changed my life, that just a way of thinking that just has made all the difference in my life.
Can you share some of that?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So Steve was very temperamental. He had enormous success at Apple, and he was larger than life. He speaks very quickly. We called it his clock speed is faster than your clock speed, so you can't keep up. He was charismatic and handsome, and he had everything going his way until he went to Next, and Next computer was failing. We weren't selling enough of them, 3,000 a month, which wasn't enough. And it was a respected computer, but at 3,000 a month, you couldn't get enough software. Like, we would have Bill Gates come down every year and try to convince him to do Microsoft Office or Microsoft Word in the day and Excel. And Bill was very open to it. He had a lot of respect for Steve, but he would say, I need to sell 1 million copies. You don't have 1 million machines. And I would say, well, we can't have 1 million machines until you put Microsoft Office. It's a chicken and the egg problem. And we never could solve that problem. And it's kind of like the network effect. So Steve was so temperamental in the day, because to go from the heights that he had been at to the lows, the press was brutal with him. He was too old. He was 36, for heaven's sakes. In tech, you can't do that. And so it was just a real big struggle. And every day I would see him and I would think, oh, whew, he's getting beat up badly. And but he still had this sort of shithead. He rode a shithead roller coaster in terms of the people around him. One day you were a hero, the next day you were, a shithead. And so he had this high staff turnover. And one of the guys who I thought was really phenomenal was my boss at Next, Mike Slade. He was the VP of marketing. I was in marketing by then, and learning from the master, Steve. And Mike had a long relationship with him because Mike was an early employee of Microsoft. His office was right next to Bill Gates. He had a great relationship with Bill Gates, and he was in charge. He was the product manager for Excel and Word and Microsoft Office. And he had overseen putting it on the Apple, and that had made Apple, if they didn't have Microsoft on there, I don't know what they would have done. So, so he was very effective at Next. I thought he was great, but he just couldn't deal with Steve anymore. And so he left, and he submitted his resignation. He had 3 reasons for leaving. And of course that offended Steve, and Steve didn't want to have anything to do with him. Eventually, Ed Catmull from Pixar went to Steve and said, Steve, you can't hold all these grudges. I think this is what happened. I wasn't there. This is what I heard happen. Steve, you can't have all these grudges. You have to let it go. And he gave this talk about focusing on the mission. I heard Barack Obama give that talk later when he was asked, why isn't there more drama in the White House? He said, well, there's 3 things you can focus on: personal ambition, personal grievance, or the mission. I tell everybody focus on the mission, because if you focus on the mission, that solves the other 2. And so Steve famously read the resignation letter 2 years later, I think it was, from Mike Slade with the 3 things, called Mike up and said, Mike, I've had time to think about these 3 things. I agree, with you were right. Will you come back and help me? And Mike came back, and it was about the time Next got bought by Apple. And then Steve was becoming CEO of Apple. And they went through the early years where they came up with colorful computers. They came up with better laptops. They did a lot of things, but still sales were not climbing like they should, even though they were building a better computer. So Mike went to the Consumer Electronics Show, heard his old boss, Bill Gates, speak, and Bill said, Windows everywhere. We're going to put Windows everywhere. It's going to be in your fridge. It's going to be in handheld devices, your watch, whatever. And Mike came back. Steve was having a weekend retreat with his executives, a lot of whom I knew, and he wanted to go into video editing because high-end Macs were having success in the studios. And it was kind of a Pixar background. And he asked them to edit a video over the weekend, and they came back and played their videos that they'd made over the weekend. And my understanding of the story, I wasn't there, but the reporting is that Mike said, it's too hard. What we need is something simpler for consumers. We need to do a music player. And so they hired a junior engineer from the company that I worked at, General Magic, Tony Fidel, who had been casting around and not succeeding at anything. They hired Tony to come be the hardware manager for the iPod. And when they did the iPod and had Mike's line in there, 10,000 songs in your pocket, and a beautiful interface and everything, and a beautiful look to it, it became 30% of Apple's sales. And then when it began to be incorporated into phones and you didn't need an external music player, Steve got pushed by serendipity into doing the iPhone. He didn't want to, but he had to. And that, completely changed the world. But by that time, he was focusing on the mission, not the personal grievance and the personal ambition. He was just focusing on the mission.
Right.
And so I took that internally and tried to do that at ADVrider because there was lots of drama there too. And the mission was the love of motorcycling. That's it. It's just our mission. We're doing things for the love of motorcycling. So when you saw this drama break out about, I did a scooter forum because I love scooters, and a lot of motorcyclists like scooters. We named it the Battle Scooter Forum. Oh my gosh, we had moderators resign over that because it was too girly. There was drama all over the place. We just focused on the mission. So that was one thing, that was a life lesson for me that I've tried to keep with me and teach my kids and, everyone around me. Focus on the mission. It's the best way to solve personal grievance and personal ambition.
You're listening to The Lowdown Show, presented by ADVrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. What are you up to now? You're heading off to Africa tomorrow, I believe?
Tomorrow, yeah, for 3 weeks.
Tell me what you're involved with now. What drives you now, Chris?
Well, so it was kind of a crazy thing. When I started 6th grade, my dad thought I was a juvenile delinquent because he got me out of juvenile hall. It's a reasonable assumption. I'd been caught for shoplifting and all that. And so he, are you hearing that noise in the background?
No.
Okay.
On. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I had to buy all my clothes. My dad told me, you got to get a job. And I'm in 6th grade. I mean, what do you mean get a job? So I became a paper boy and earned you could earn some pretty good money being a paper boy. You could earn $1 a day and $30 a month. That was amazing. Ride my bike around throwing papers and everything. And then I got a job in a bakery washing pans. And I think I was only 14 at the time. You could do that in those days. And then I found out that you could carry bags for golfers around Dorinda Country Club and make a lot of money. You could make $14 in a day if you did 2 rounds. No, $28 a day, because one bag on one shoulder, one bag on another shoulder, and if you $7 each, and then if you did it twice, it's $28. So I did that. I became a caddy, and I loved being a caddy, and I wanted to be the best caddy in the world. I was sort of making up for this background I had. I was self-conscious about my accent. It was East Oakland kind of ghetto accent, and choice of words and everything. And I was trying to hide that. I didn't want people to know. It was embarrassing. So I was just doing everything in my power to. So one day the caddy master assigned me to caddy for Jack LaLanne, who was a big star in the day. He was like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the day. He had a TV show that lasted 36 years, an exercise and diet show. And he had a Hollywood star. He had cookbook, various books, and he was amazing. So I got to caddy for him, and I remember him asking me to pour out my orange soda. I'd paid 5 cents for that soda. Pour out my orange soda. I shouldn't drink it. It'd make cavities in my teeth. And on the other shoulder, I had the bag for Rick Barry, who was guard for the Warriors. He was the MVP of the league, and then the MVP of the finals when the Warriors won the finals. He was like 6'7" and skinny, and Jack was like 5'6" and muscular. And Rick never talked to me, but Jack did. And one of the problems I was having is my father, who had developed heart disease in his 60s, and in the day, the doctors didn't want him to strain his heart and exercise. So I had to mow the lawn and all that, because that would strain his heart. And, he had a gut, and he had gout and high blood pressure, and had all these pills and everything else. And he was a real heavy red meat eater. I mean, on the grill every night, lots of red meat. So we had breakfast of bacon and eggs, and lunch of liverwurst sandwiches. Remember liverwurst? And and dinner of, sirloin steak and whatever. And so I asked Jack, about my dad's diet, because Jack was telling me, if it comes from a cow or a pig, don't eat it. If it comes from a factory made by man, don't eat it. If it comes from, I want you to eat 4 fruits and 8 vegetables every day, or some number like that. I remember it was a big number. And and it's like, if you don't eat the meat, you won't miss it. And it's like, yeah, right, I won't miss it. It's delicious. I mean, bacon and, my dad cooks on the grill and puts steak sauce on it. It's amazing. And so I told my dad about it, and my dad said, he's not a doctor. You can't be listening to a gym rat. He's not a doctor. I listen to doctors, and they write these books on low carbohydrate diets. And later on, after I graduated from high school, Atkins came out with the Atkins diet, and my dad, went with that. But there were many low carb diets for decades before that, and high meat. And so I went back and told that to Jack, and Jack said, well, I wanted to be a doctor, but I decided prevention was better than having sick people come and try to cure them from diseases that are caused by what they eat. And so I told my dad that, and my dad, no, I don't think so. So my dad died of a heart attack when he was 70. Jack he was a good swimmer, among other things. They handcuffed him with his hands behind his back. This is true. It's on YouTube. You can see it for yourself. Handcuffed him, shackled him, tied a harness around his waist, threw him in the bay to swim a mile, but not just swim a mile. He was towing 70 boats, 70 skiffs, with 70 people in those boats, shackled and handcuffed for a mile for the TV cameras and everything. He did these things. He did that to celebrate his 70th birthday. He was a magnificent specimen when he was 70, and he lived till he was 96. And so, I sort of forgot about this, but I inherited the family genes, terrible family genes of high cholesterol. And I have 2 copies of the APO4E gene that predisposes you to Alzheimer's. Only 2% of the population has that. and I had a a birth defect in my heart that predisposes me to strokes, and a childhood virus that scarred my left ventricle. So I had all kinds of health problems. I've been in emergency rooms too many times and had a tumor removed from my temple and that ate part of my skull and went back, all kinds of things. So that got me quite interested in diet and health. So I've been interested and studied it all my life. And I decided when I retired, since it also ties to earth science, every earth scientist in the world that I'm aware of, I've never heard of an exception, who cares about or knows anything about climate change or the environment or whatever, they eat a totally plant-based diet. They don't eat any animal foods at all because we know what's going on. We see this and no one else seems to see it or care. They don't want to know. And so I was interested, is it really healthy to eliminate everything, fish and eggs and chicken and all that kind of stuff? So I established this YouTube channel called Plant Chompers, and it's all about nutrition and the environment. That's why I was at Stanford yesterday, because long story. And it's taking off. Some of the episodes are, getting millions of views or 500,000 views or 100,000 views. And it's all about plant dominant diets. It's not about being vegan, although it sounds that way. I just amuse myself with the name. Mediterranean diets, DASH diet, Asian diets, vegetarian diets, vegan diets, just plant dominant diets. Stanford has this recommendation, same as Harvard: make 75% of your plate whole plant foods. More is better, all the way up to 100%. And I use as a model the Canadian Food Guide. It's one of the best food guides out there. So
and very controversial. The most recent one is very controversial, especially with the beef farmers in Alberta.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, the beef, when I was in geophysics, ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers and Rupert Murdoch and everybody came in to create the perception among half the population that climate change wasn't happening. It's the simplest chemistry in the world. You put CO2 in the atmosphere, the earth gets warmer. I mean, I didn't think anything that basic could be denied, but it was. And they don't listen to all the earth scientists. They listen to ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers. It's the same in the food industry, but the big bad player in there, the ExxonMobil of the food industry with the brass knuckles, and that's willing to sue Oprah and all that, is the Cattlemen's Association. They are an unbelievable force, and no politician can do anything about it, because in all 50 states, raising cattle is a big thing, and it's a huge 1.7 trillion worldwide business. There's so much money that goes behind that, and they pay these influencers. They have a program called the MBA program, the meat something. You get the certificate about becoming an influencer advocate, meet something advocate, I don't know, advocacy. And they pay you by the post that you make. They have an $8 million budget in America to pay influencers to promote beef, YouTubers and things. It's just crazy. And so, but that's the world we live in, especially in America.
In closing, a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.